Greetings. My name is Kiera Eckhardt, and I am a doctoral candidate in anthropology at the University of Kansas. Today, I'll be discussing my dissertation research, which creates an ethnography of migration in Quito, Ecuador. Ecuador presents a particularly compelling case. It hosts one of the largest Venezuelan refugee populations in South America, and at the same time, it is the only country in the world with a constitutional commitment to universal citizenship. So, this presentation asks a central question. What does that policy actually look like in practice for migrants and for the communities around them? And more broadly, what can Ecuador tell us about the possibilities and limits of humanitarian migration policy? I'll begin with some national and historical context, then move into my fieldwork experiences in Quito, and finally share general findings from interviews to evaluate whether Ecuador's migration framework is substantive in practice or more rhetorical in nature. So, Ecuador is a country of about 18 million people located on the Pacific northwest coast of South America, with Colombia to the northeast and Peru cupping a majority of the country to the south. Migration has long shaped the country, from early Arab and Lebanese migration during the coca boom to more recent flows from Colombia, Peru, Haiti, and Cuba. A major turning point came in 2008 when Ecuador adopted a universal citizenship framework under the President Rafael Correa, followed by the 2017 Human Mobility Law, which promotes regional free movement. On paper, this positions Ecuador as one of the most open migration systems in the world. However, since late 2010s, Ecuador has also become a major destination for Venezuelan migrants fleeing economic and political crisis. Today, millions of Venezuelans have left their country, a total of 7.9 million according to the UNHCR as of 2025, with Ecuador hosting the fourth largest population in the region, despite being significantly smaller than neighboring countries. Here we begin to see a key contradiction. While Venezuelans make up the majority of asylum applicants in Ecuador, only a very small number are actually granted refugee status each year. At the same time, migrants are deeply embedded in the economy, particularly in retail, construction, and service sectors, and are largely of working age, often supporting families and children. So structurally, migrants are essential, but legally and socially, their position is far more precarious. On paper, Ecuador provides relatively strong protections. Migrants can access healthcare and education, and there are multiple visa pathways. But in practice, there are significant barriers, especially around documentation. If migrants miss key administrative deadlines, they may be required to leave the country simply to re-enter legally. There is also growing distrust in institutions. Surveys from service provider organizations I interviewed on background show declining confidence in both government agencies and humanitarian organizations. One service provider I spoke with described repeatedly assisting families through application processes, only for them to remain in limbo or be denied without clear explanation. At the same time, migrants, particularly Venezuelans, face increasing xenophobia. There have been protests, forced removals, and instances of public violence in multiple cities. So again, we see a gap between policy ideals and lived realities. My perspective on this began during my time serving in the Peace Corps in Ecuador. While living in Quito, I stayed in a neighborhood called Tumbaco. Every day as I entered and left, I passed graffiti painted in red at the entrance that read, "Venezuelans go home." Within my first week, my host mother also warned me not to go out at night because a week before I arrived, there was a violent incident that the community thought had been perpetrated by a Venezuelan man. These early experiences shaped my understanding of how migration was being discussed at the community level, not just as policy, but as fear, perception, and narrative. When I returned to Ecuador in 2024 to conduct research, I encountered a different but related set of challenges. Through interviews with refugee service providers in Quito, I found that support systems were highly fragmented. Rather than one centralized organization offering comprehensive services, migrants were often referred to multiple organizations at once to meet their needs, each addressing only part of their needs. I also learned about new legal requirements mandating that migrants register within 90 days of entering the country or risk deportation. Service providers expressed concern that these policies could disrupt already fragile integration processes. During that same trip, there was a car bomb explosion outside of my hotel. What stood out to me was not only the event itself, but that I could not find any media coverage of it afterward. This raised questions about visibility, narrative control, and what kinds of insecurity are publicly acknowledged. In 2025, I returned to Quito and conducted 25 ethnographic interviews with migrants and community members. Across these interviews, several key themes emerged. First, there was a widespread perception of economic tension. Many participants described Ecuador as more stable than neighboring countries, yet simultaneously emphasized a lack of job opportunities. Migrants were often seen as both necessary to the economy and as competitors within it. Second, xenophobia toward Venezuelans was frequently discussed, but it did not exist in isolation. Participants also pointed to long-standing inequalities within Ecuador, particularly discrimination toward indigenous populations. In this sense, anti-migrant sentiment often reflected deeper social hierarchies rather than creating entirely new ones. Third, there was a notable sense of institutional distrust. Participants expressed skepticism not only toward government policies, but also toward humanitarian organizations. This distrust was less about outright opposition and more about disengagement, a feeling that institutions were ineffective or inaccessible. Finally, many participants consistently identified Guayaquil as the most dangerous city in the country. This perception was shaped both by personal experiences and by what participants described as pervasive media narratives. Taken together, these findings suggest that while Ecuador's universal citizenship framework is symbolically powerful, its implementation is uneven. Legal access to services may exist, but bureaucratic barriers, fragmented institutions, and social tensions significantly shape how migrants experience daily life. Ultimately, Ecuador illustrates an important lesson for humanitarian migration policy more broadly. Progressive legal frameworks alone are not sufficient. Their success depends on infrastructure, consistency, and more importantly, social trust. Ecuador shows us both the possibilities and the limitations of an open migration model, offering a vision of inclusion while also revealing the challenges of making that vision real in practice. For comments or feedback on this research, please contact me at kiera.eckhart@ku.edu. My doctoral research is based on a multi-sited ethnographic approach where I've conducted 25 ethnographic interviews in the Andean region, in the capital city of Quito, Ecuador, as well as 25 ethnographic interviews in the most populated coastal city and also the most populated city in the country, Guayaquil, Ecuador. This research has been generously supported by the Madison and Lila Self-Graduate Fellowship, the Tinker Field Research Grant through the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Carol D. Clark Field Research Grant, all stemming from the University of Kansas. Thank you so much for your time.